Hey everyone, welcome to Impossible Trade-Offs. I'm your host, Katie Harbath. Today we are bringing you a conversation with Nina Jankowicz. So Nina is a name that you might be familiar with because she was one of the first researchers to be thrown into the crosshairs around the conversation of research, disinformation, and whether or not, if what they're doing is censorship or not when it includes domestic actors. And Nina was a part of this Disinformation Governance Board, very poorly named, which we'll go into this. And that was when she was really thrust into the spotlight. Since then, she's written a book about being a woman online, and she also recently started a project called the American Sunlight Project to try to raise awareness and stand up for what the facts are in the conversations about what these researchers are trying to do. One of the things she's also trying to do is encourage and put pressure on Jim Jordan and the House committee in doing a lot of these investigations to release the transcripts of the depositions that these researchers have done. Now, when we recorded this conversation, her transcript had not yet been released, but last week on Friday, Congressman Jordan did release that transcript. And so just know that that was some news that happened in between us having this conversation. But I really wanted to bring her on to talk about not only her work in this space, but also how we are seeing this potentially spread globally, these types of investigations. I should also be honest, I am an advisor on the American Sunlight Project. I really wanted to be a part of this because I think that the research that these people are doing is really important. I also think that Congressman Jordan and others have some very valid questions about the role of the government in this process and what this should look like. I definitely think we need checks and balances across all these different people working on this very delicate thing around speech. However, I don't agree with harassing them. I don't agree with the other things and how some of these researchers have been treated as part of doing their work. And also, we've just seen a lot of muddling of the facts of what it is that they're exactly doing, what their relationships are to this tech companies, what their relationships are to the government, etc. And so we go through all of that, and we also talk a little bit about the history of all of this, of going back to, the early 2013, 2014, and some of the initial stuff with Russia and Ukraine, which is a moment in time that a lot of people in the disinfo space actually got their start and really have seen the latest chapter kind of get going. So anyways, I hope you really enjoy this conversation. Nina Jankowicz, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Katie. It's great to be with you.
So I'm guessing that a lot of my listeners might recognize your name, but they may not know everything about you, your background, how you got into work researching around disinformation, all that. So I thought we'd start with giving you a chance to tell us a bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I first started working on disinformation, I would say 2013, when the Euromaidan protests in Ukraine kicked off. I was working at the time for the National Democratic Institute on programs in the Eurasia region, and I felt like I was pretty lonely in the idea that the internet was big with this. Like, people were talking about quote unquote fake news back then, right? But nobody was really talking about how Russia in particular was using disinformation as a geopolitical strategy. And in my work at NDI, I really lobbied hard for us to be more vocal online, which for an organization like NDI, which is a great organization, but got its start kind of during the Cold War, that was strange for a lot of people. So that's really where I first started thinking about these issues. And a few years later, I ended up in Ukraine on a Fulbright fellowship where I was advising the Ministry of Foreign Affairs during the Poroshenko administration on countering disinformation and strategic shifts. And I happened to be there when the US election in 2016 was going down. And so seeing that all happen from the vantage point of Kyiv, which had such a kind of trenchant experience with disinformation that really affected people's lives a few years earlier, was so interesting to watch. And frankly, to see the hubris with which the United States reacted to Russian disinformation. It was like, oh, we got this under control, right? Like, this isn't a big deal. But I was seeing firsthand how big of a deal it could be and how it was fueling a conflict. And so that's where I started really digging in on this research. I started researching for my first book, How to Lose the Information War, which looks at how 6 countries in Central and Eastern Europe dealt with disinformation ahead of when the US even recognized it was a problem. Then I came back and was at the Wilson Center for a couple of years, which is where you and I first met, of course, when you were still at Facebook, and Facebook was working with Wilson to fund some research into disinformation. So there I looked into kind of the limits of counter disinformation programming and how they often ran up against free speech, which is an important note for all the conspiracists that I'm sure don't listen to your podcast. But, people like to say that I have no respect for free speech. I actually wrote a whole paper investigating how counter disinfo stuff can sometimes tread on free speech. And then we did some work looking at online abuse of women in politics and public life as well, which often has an interesting nexus with disinformation. So that was my my kind of academic and professional pedigree, I'd say, up until 2022 or so.
That's great. I actually have so many questions coming out of that because I didn't know we had the NDI IRI connection. I didn't know that you had that background there, or I forgot about it. And so I do want to ask you really quickly on that, because one of the things that I've wanted to think about and research a bit more is, like you said, so for those of you who aren't familiar, coming out of the Cold War, Ronald Reagan did this speech in Westminster, or at Westminster, about spreading democracy around the world and how America can do that and what's needed. And a congressional commission was set up to look at that. And coming out of that was the National Endowment for Democracy, which was set up specifically so that it couldn't be, that the funding would be consistent no matter who the sort of administration was, whether Republican or Democrat. But then you had these implementing organizations get set up. So you have the National Democratic Institute, you have the International Republican Institute, you also have IFES, which works with electoral systems, and a few others that were set up. Now, NDI and IRI have D and R in their names, but they don't go off internet. They work on the same things internationally, right? Like they're not out there to promote the D and the R on that. But I think that those institutions were built at a time when democracy was on the upswing, frankly. And I feel like we need to rethink them for this age of democracy we're in right now, what it means to fight democracy backsliding in even established democracies, and what that looks like in the digital age. And so I'm throwing you an unexpected question, but you brought it up, and I was like, oh my gosh, I would really love your thoughts on this, because I think it's something that when we look at in America of what institutions we have, are they staying up to date for the age that we're in?
Yeah, I think, I still think NDI and IRI do really, really important work around the world. But I will say that when I was at NDI, it was kind of the heyday of the Obama era. And a lot of what we were doing, working with civil society organizations and political parties in other countries, was kind of the Obama playbook for digital democracy. And that was a playbook for digital democracy that took the promise of the Arab Spring and embraced it and said, this is how we can get more participation. This is how we can really inject, civics into people's everyday life. And that's really important. Don't get me wrong. And I think some of that promise still exists, but it undersold the potential harms of the internet as well. And so I think institutions like NDI and IRI have had to grapple with that. And for what it's worth, I think, they've both got great people at their institutions now who are grappling with harms and disinformation and information integrity and all those sorts of things. They weren't set up. I think you're absolutely right for that backsliding moment that we started to experience, I would say around 2015 or so. And what you see actually is both institutions kind of reinvigorating programs in places in Central and Eastern Europe that had so-called graduated from U.S. assistance many years prior, places like Hungary, even Poland for a long time. We see a similar trend in U.S. government programs for free expression and information integrity and things like that in those areas. And so it's not a problem with just them, but the whole kind of way that we have about thinking about democracy promotion, not only in the digital age, but writ large, right? Democracy is not an endpoint. We're constantly working on it. And so I think there's two things to say there. One, that we need to preserve some of these relationships and constantly be looking and watching some of the democratic expansions and contractions, let's call them, in our allies abroad. But we also need to look at it in the mirror, right? I think so much of our democracy programming maybe falls a little flat on our allies' ears because we have such problems at home right now. And I think for what it's worth, I do think those institutions are learning and adapting and trying to, but they're big, hulking institutions that have been around for so long. So it just takes a little while sometimes.
Oh, I 100% agree with you. And I didn't mean to say that I think they're doing fantastic work. It's just,
Totally.
It is
Yeah.
hard to move. It is hard to move its battleship around, right? And think about
Yep.
the programming and all of that. So I want to kind of jump in to you're most well known for this very short-lived agency in the Biden administration. And like just to get it out of the way right away, for as much as you can kind of share with it, I'm curious what happened from your perspective, because you mentioned you were at the Wilson Center, you're getting into this work, you got into it early, and so you've established yourself as an expert, and then you get asked to work in this agency. Level set for us first of what the goals of that agency were, because that's gotten all sort of out of whack in this environment now, and what the
Exactly.
conspiracy theories.
Yes. Totally out of whack. So the Disinformation Governance Board, which is a terrible name that I did not come up with, but
We will all agree it was a terrible
all of
name.
the governing documents, by the way, yes, all the governing documents, by the way, for anyone who cares to look them up, have now been FOIA'd or otherwise released. So like people can look at the charter. The point of the board was to bring together the disparate parts of DHS, things like the FEMA, which deals with emergency management, Customs and Border Protection, which we all know what they deal with, right? The policy bodies, the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agency, CISA, to bring everybody together who was working or had kind of competencies or portfolios that dealt with disinformation, and make sure that they were all marching to the beat of the same drummer. It was a policy coordination shop. The board was sat in the Directorate for Policy. I was the only employee. It had no budget, no operational authority. My job was to herd government cats. And unfortunately, when this got announced in, I will say, an opaque and not detailed enough manner by the Department of Homeland Security, some people in both the far right of the Republican Party and some on the far left thought of this as a political opportunity. And they said, this is going to be a censorship body. This is going to be a ministry of truth. And unfortunately, I think the way that everything went from there, the non-response from the Biden administration, the kind of neglect of me and my personal safety, and also, frankly, like the unrecognition of disinformation as an issue that they really should stick to their guns about, essentially meant that they rolled over and gave those folks a win. They said, you know what, we're not going to wither in the face of these attacks. I decided to resign because they didn't seem like they had my back, and I had a baby coming into the world. I had, bigger fish to fry. And that set the stage for what we've now seen over the past 2 years. It's actually almost, as we're recording this, almost exactly 2 years to the day that I resigned. What we've seen is just an attack on anybody working on disinformation issues, and people saying that they are censoring people when all they're doing is research. All they're doing is, getting good information out into the public sphere, looking at connections between people. And that's not even anything what the board had anything to do with, right? It was all about coordinating within government. It had no purview or authority to decide what was true or false on the internet or anywhere else. And I wouldn't have wanted to do that, especially given my background in, authoritarian transitions and things like that. I've seen what that can do to a country. And so it was, I think, an important lesson for a government to learn, but I don't think the Biden administration has learned it, unfortunately. I'm worried that other governments haven't kind of taken a note, because I think it's coming from that to them as well.
Other governments, you mean elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think we're seeing this narrative be exported most recently to the United Kingdom. There's been kind of a big brouhaha there as some conservative outlets are attacking the Global Disinformation Index, which is kind of a brand safety organization that lets advertisers know not only if disinformation is on their sites, but of certain narratives that they find to be anti-democratic. They let advertisers know about them, and then advertisers decide whether or not they want to advertise on those sites. They're not the only organization doing that, right? And that's ultimately a speech issue, and advertisers can make that decision. But they've been now targeted at different outlets in the UK and some folks here in the States as well, saying that they are ultimately censoring. And I think this is an important point, because censorship can only come from the government, right? Everybody else has free speech rights. If they convince somebody to advertise on a site or not advertise on the site, if they convince the social media platform to take something down or not take something down, or just bring it to their attention, that's ultimately a speech question. And we want to preserve that speech for everybody.
Yeah, I was actually one of those outlets. I was on a panel to the House of Lords with, and it was my first issue with that person. And then I was also seeing today that
Oof.
David Cameron said the UK is going to stop funding the Global Disinformation Index, which I think there, to your point,
Yep.
there's a interesting intersection here that hasn't fully come together yet. It has a little bit, but the brand safety question and speech
Mm.
with, I mean, Elon has been pushing it for a while of like being at, he's said some very colorful words to advertisers who don't want to advertise on X because they're like, I don't want my stuff to be next to that. And I'm like, if I'm a corporate advertiser right now, I can understand why you might be wanting to sit out the election, because now you might get dragged into it, let alone just where you're choosing to spend your money and where you're wanting to have your content
Yeah, absolutely.
sit next to.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And that's up to brands, right? Yeah. I mean, if they, let's just pick on some brands that I've got around me right now. I have some Cheez-Its and some Honey Nut Cheerios. If General Mills is going to say like, we don't believe in global warming. Let's just say, let's use that as an example, right? If they don't want to be in any sites that have pro climate science views, that's up to them, right? That they can say that to the advertising exchanges that they participate in. And if they're informed of that by some anti-climate group, like that's their prerogative. That's not censorship. That's like a causal speech chain that, good luck disrupting that.
Well, and that's the market coming into force too. Like it's not even, there's, you know, people can decide, and advertisers anyways, like you said, they can do that. But it's, it shows just how this issue is permeating. They're trying to permeate it into every part of society and kind of thinking about
Mm-hmm.
this. And there was something you said in the beginning that I think is right now to put this question in, that I think about a lot as well, because I'm a pretty far free speech advocate. I mean, I'm not total in it, but I'm pretty far out there of like, I'm really reluctant to take stuff down. I'm really, really reluctant to it.
Mm-hmm.
But I believe in content moderation. I believe in studying this work. I believe we need to understand our information environment. I believe we need to dig into those nuances. And I think that can be balanced with protecting people's rights to expression. And you mentioned writing a paper on that. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about how you sort of thought about that framework, and how you balance the two.
Yeah, so this was an interesting time to be writing about the balance of kind of free speech and protecting the information environment and making sure that people had good information at their fingertips. That paper came out in December of 2020, I believe. So like really, really interesting time. And it was the culmination of looking at a bunch of different paths to dealing with disinformation, both on the Democratic side and on the less Democratic side. And I mean that small d, not large d. So just democracies dealing with it. We looked at Singapore, Ukraine, Germany, and Brazil, 4 countries that had legend on the books at that point that had been at least being debated, if not enacted, and looked at the potential implications for free speech. So in Germany at the time, what we had on the books was NetzDG, the Network Enforcement Act, which many of your listeners will be familiar, is the law that forces platforms to take down illegal content relating to hate speech or otherwise illegal content within a certain period of time or be fined. And at that point, what we found from some research was that actually platforms tended to over-enforce against what they thought might be illegal content because they were afraid of getting fined. And so that was having unintended free speech implications. Now, of course, the German government wanted to be protecting against hate speech. What it ended up doing was, because of this fear of getting fined, again, the platforms were over removing speech, and often removing speech that had to do with like minority rights and things like that. That was where things tended to get taken down. And so eventually NetzDG, after the publication of the paper, ended up being amended to try to give the platforms a little bit more leeway into how they responded and be more precise in the types of speech that needed to be taken down based on German code. So I think what we saw there, and one of the conclusions that we made, was that the platforms were painted with too broad of a stroke. Like obviously meta platforms look different to TikTok, look different to Twitter, or how they used to look anyway. And that they each need to be viewed with a different lens and make sure that kind of those attributes are really like specific for each platform. And that's hard to do as a regulator, obviously. Then we looked more at the anti-democratic side of things. Singapore has its POF legislation, which essentially gives a political actor in Singapore the right to label any content that it deems false, and then levy fines against the people who are publishing that content. And what we found was actually that the POFMA legislation was being used in order to silence government critics. So this is every free speech advocate's worst nightmare, right? You don't want a political actor forward to take action against their political rivals based on political inclinations or political goals. And that's what everyone worried, Donald Trump would do, or he will do if he is elected to a second term in office. And frankly, that is the argument that many on the far right and far left made about the Disinformation Governance Board. The only problem was that, of course, the board had no authority or purview to do any of that, right? And I wholly agree with them. I think that sort of thing, as I say in that paper from 2020, that is not the sort of legislation that should be on the books. If we are going to have oversight and regulatory authority over social media platforms, that needs to be a completely apolitical body. And we recommend that in the paper as well. Similarly, Ukraine had proposed a law very similar to that. It got tabled during the pandemic because they had bigger fish to fry, and then the war, the full-scale invasion happened, so it hasn't come back. There have been a couple of other somewhat draconian free speech measures or anti-free speech measures that have been put into place in Ukraine's context because they're at war. Advocates like me have suggested that they put sunset clauses in the pieces of legislation so that when the national security dilemma is ended, when the war ends, basically, those clauses and those restrictions will go away. So that is another thing, that these laws should be reviewed time and time again. The good option that we had in that paper was Brazil, which in its civil rights bill for the internet, the Marco Civil, I'm probably saying that with horrible Portuguese, so I apologize to anybody who's listening. But that is really a landmark piece of legislation in that it was developed with a lot of consultation to civil society and rights groups over many, many years. And from what I understand of the Brazilian landscape, are not always great at enforcing against their legislation, but at least the legislation is there on the books. And that has actually, I think, resulted, and I'm interested in your take on this, Katie, too, in some interesting interactions with the platforms, in that especially the large platforms have been forced to have offices in Brazil. Obviously, it's a huge market, but that means that there is kind of a lot more contact and a lot more understanding of the social political environment that the Brazilian internet is operating under. And I think that's a great model for democracies around the world.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unique things about Brazil that are absolutely worth looking into, because I think, on one hand, you do have also the TSE, their electoral commission has done a fantastic job of working with tech companies, working with civil society, also of communicating just the strength of their actual admin of the electoral process and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
I think the challenge with Brazil, though, is also how litigious of a country it is. Anytime that there was an election there, when I was at Facebook, you had to have hundreds of lawyers on contract because any judge could, rule against, somebody can bring a case very quickly. A judge can rule very quickly. And actually, WhatsApp, actually was a Facebook employee, but was arrested because a judge wanted data from WhatsApp.
Wow.
That WhatsApp was like, we can't give you because we're encrypted. And the VP got off a plane and was arrested and went to jail for a couple of hours. So the challenge with having the employees on the ground is something like that can happen too. But when I was down there for their most recent election in 22, porters and others who do similar work to what you do were saying about how, like, what is now happening to you and others here in the United States with having lawsuits against you and stuff like that is happening in Brazil because of how easy it is to file a lawsuit, to get something in front of a judge. And I think there were a lot of questions. The Superior Court in Brazil nominated one judge, could make the Superior Court judge, I'm blanking on his name right now, could make a decision about whether or not platforms had to take down content or not. And there's a lot of people that were like, great, there's one person in the government that can do it. And it's like, and it's problematic. It's like, okay, you might like this benevolent dictator, but like, what happens if you don't like the next one, that comes along? And so I think But what I like about what you're bringing into this entire conversation is the global nature and interconnectedness of these issues, how they
Mm.
all play off of one another. And you mentioned you mentioned this as well. Like, I was thinking about just the fact that, we went from Arab Spring to Obama campaign to what was happening in Ukraine in a 3 to 4 year period. And I think we forget that,
Yeah.
right? That, like, it actually was,
Yep.
there were signs there that we just weren't paying attention to. We didn't have hubris, in the United States.
Yeah.
We were all like, no, we've got this covered. Then you've seen a lot of other tactics being moved, Steve Bannon and others, very famously, Brazil was a big target for a lot of their online platforms, stuff like that. And I want to get into that a little bit more, because part of, and I want to talk more about the harassment and everything that you faced, but you're also trying to do a lot more to push back on these narratives, and you're also trying to warn people about what might be coming for their countries. And so let me start with this question: how have you seen these narratives and tactics ebb and flow throughout the world over the decade plus that you've been working on these issues?
That's a good question. I feel like we could be here all day if I went into the super detailed answer. I mean, I think so. Especially in the States, we conceived of disinformation from teen onward as something that was just foreign. And that always really ground my gears, right? Is the thing that is most misunderstood, Russian disinformation in particular, but I would include all kind of foreign adversary nation state disinfo in there, is that it's not, for the most part, making stuff up whole cloth. Sure, there might be a crazy narrative about, XYZ politician in there once in a while, but the stuff that performs the best is the stuff that is playing off of and amplifying these pre-existing fissures in our societies, these real grievances that people have. And that means that we're only as strong as our weakest link at home. And so when you have people who are playing at disinfo for power and for profit in the domestic ecosystem, that leaves us way, way, way more open to foreign manipulation. And it's not successful 100% of the time, but the stuff I'm most worried about is the domestic stuff. So that's kind of the big shift that I think a lot of people misunderstood. From 2016, we were so focused on Russia, Russia, Russia. I think the Dems totally overplayed their hand there. That being said, I think some folks in the Republican Party didn't want too much of a magnifying glass on their behavior too during the Trump administration. And so we've ended up in this situation where disinformation has become this untouchable topic. And that's not okay, because as I've always said, disinformation doesn't know a political party. Its ultimate victim is democracy. It's coming for all of us, whether we like it or not. And we're seeing that now with AI, of course. So we've seen that evolve, or evolution of disinfo, but we've also seen disinfo used against particular people, which I think you are alluding to here, people and organizations. It's like the very research, the very act of speaking out about these threats or against these threats has made some people a target. And I've been through it, but many of our colleagues and friends in the trust and safety and counter disinfo research space have now also been targeted by political players in the United States who are targeting them for a very specific reason. And that reason is to shut them up ahead of the 2024 election. We've also seen people who are standing up for online safety and, again, standing up for the truth around the world. People like Maria Ressa from Rappler in the Philippines. People like Julie Inman Grant, who's the e-safety commissioner in Australia, who's recently been on the receiving end of Elon Musk's ire because she has these transparency powers that can compel him to answer questions about child sexual abuse material and disinfo and other kind of harmful content on the site. And organizations like GDI in the UK, all of these people have a couple of things in common. Actually, I was going to say they have in common that they're standing up for the truth and transparency. They also have in common that they're all women. And I don't think that that's a coincidence. What we have seen is that the stickiest attacks against me, against all of those women I just mentioned, against the American women in the counter disinformation research space, the people who have been hit the hardest are women, and we've been hit with gendered, sexualized, misogynistic attacks. We have plenty of male colleagues, and yeah, they get some abuse sometimes, but generally, their families, their children, their sexuality, their reproductive status is not brought into the conversation. I think that's something that we need to note. And it kind of goes along with the rollback of women's rights all around the world that we're seeing kind of under attack over the past couple of years as well. So those are some broad general trends, but I'm now worried that, you know, this has been going on in a concerted way in the United States for 2 years. Of course, Maria Ressa dealt with all of it before any of us did. And I'm happy every time I see another announcement that one of her lawsuits has been thrown out or that she's been found to not be at fault and all this other stuff. She is truly in the vanguard of all of that. But those tactics, the lawfare, the investigations that are powered by either, you know, governments or legislative bodies, the smear campaigns that are overly personalized, that has become totally normalized now. And it's certainly normalized in American politics. And I'm worried that our allies, particularly in Europe, where bureaucracy is strong and they have faith in their bureaucracy to deal with all of this stuff, I worry that that is going to be far too slow moving to deal with this exigent threat as it is coming for them during and after what is a consequential election year for them as it is for us.
So I was reading your second book, How to Be a Woman Online, when I was like prepping for this, and I was rereading the introduction again about, you know, a theoretical, though I have to say, when I was reading through it, I was like, yeah, that's happened to me in person. That's happened to me in person. And then you were like, this is a theoretical online situation. I was like, I think it's actually in both women face. But it was basically a situation where it's like on your way to work, you're harassed and it's like a gentleman's like, what, am I too good for you? You know, using the explicitive, you know, saying that you're not worth anything. Do you have an Adam's apple? Basically constant harassment and nobody helps you until you get into the office. And then you're like, I'm going to work from home today. And that's what it's like online. And so go into that a little bit more about, because we have a lot of people that talk about it, but I think until you actually experience it, it's a totally different thing about how different it is to be a woman in general, but to be a woman online facing this.
Yeah. So that scenario, and I should note too, the second book, How to Be a Woman Online, was published before the worst harassment I've ever experienced. So I think that's quite interesting. It came out 5 days. Yeah, it needs an update, particularly now with X being so different. But I mean, here's the thing I wanted to get across with that scenario, which is if any of these things happen to you IRL in real life, people would be shocked and they would be like, you need to get a protective order or a restraining order immediately. Like, let's get the cops to help you. Like, or people, you know, your fellow like travelers on the metro or whatever would stand up for you. We hope, I hope we haven't gotten that far where they wouldn't just let it happen. If somebody were like sexually harassing you or pleasuring himself in like, you know, your vicinity or whatever. And the problem is on the internet, it's just seen as par for the course, right? That you just get abused on the internet if you're a woman. And like I said, the men, and this is backed up by data, by the way. ISD did a study of this in 2020 about candidates for office. There have been several of other studies in other countries that have looked at the abuse that male and female public figures receive. And what they find time and time again is that women online receive more vitriolic, sexualized, and frankly, just violent speech than their male counterparts do. And often when male counterparts are being abused, they are abused with speech that is feminizing them, right? So it's gendered in its own way, but it's a bad thing to be a woman. So that's what I wanted to get across with that scenario. But then even, you know, outside of my own personal experience, I've done focus groups with women who have been experiencing high levels of online abuse, and everybody deals with it differently. But I will say that everyone I have spoken to, from high school aged girls all the way up to preeminent experts in their fields of journalism, in academia, in the trust and safety, et cetera, even some celebrities have said that there is a silencing effect. So when you are getting this amount of abuse, everything you say online, you are weighing, is it worth it for me to engage on this today? Not even on this topic. Is it worth it for me to engage on this platform? And I think that that is really sad, because if we're aiming toward a society that is democratic and equitable, then the women who are engaging online need to have the same kind of proclivity to post that the most confident white cisgender dude does as well, right? And that's just not the case. And we do find, we did some research at the Wilson Center in 2020 that looked at women on both sides of the aisle running for office in 2020. And we found, in particular, women of intersectional backgrounds, if they were gay or ethnically or racially diverse, in addition to being a woman, that they receive compounded abuse as well. Again, backed up by the data. I mean, this is an extent problem. And I really like what Danielle Citron, the privacy scholar, says. In fact, I've got right under my Cheez-Its her book here, her first book, Hate Crimes in Cyberspace. She also has a new book called The Fight for Privacy. I highly recommend both of them. She says in Hate Crimes in Cyberspace that in our mothers' generations, sexual harassment in the workplace used to be the norm. Now it's the norm for us to get harassed online. But we can change that, right? And I'm not saying that these people deserve to be thrown in jail. Maybe if you're making deepfake pornography, but that's a whole other can of worms, right? But we need the online platforms that are supposed to be, enforcing their terms of service, which say that targeted harassment based on gender, based on ethnicity, based on religion, et cetera, that those things aren't allowed. We need them to stick up for the vulnerable populations online. And that's something that I've tried to bring the conversation back to. I don't want everybody online to be kind of censored by some feminazi somewhere, right? Like, that's not what I'm asking for. I'm just asking for a modicum of support when I get a rape threat or rape threat after rape threat after rape threat, which tends to be more of the reality.
So time has really flown by. I can't believe it's already 40 minutes in, or about 40 minutes in. And speaking of standing up, we got to talk about the American Sunlight Project. This is your new project to help stand up against some of this stuff. So tell us about it.
Yeah, so American Sunlight came to be because after almost 2 full years of dealing with frivolous lawsuits and congressional investigations and harassment and abuse and blah, 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 I got tired of nobody really sticking up their hand and saying, hang on a second, this stuff is all lies. We've got an important election coming up. We need to not only stand up for researchers who are just trying to protect their country and to put good information out there. We need to stand up for the ideals that make America what it is. And that means respecting people. It means getting people good information and informing voters that is not partisan. It's information that just helps them at the ballot box. We need people to explain the effect that disinformation has on everyday Americans' lives. And that's true whether you're a researcher or a nurse or a school teacher or what have you. This is something that is affecting everybody in the choices that they're making. And that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to tell that story to the American public in an important year, right? We think that this is an issue that is on the ballot. And we're not asking for Americans to vote one way or the other, but we're asking them to kind of center truth in their decision making going forward. We're also going to be doing some engagement with Capitol Hill. Actually, that's already underway to encourage more transparency related to conversations about disinformation and the investigations that are going on there, and to really return truth and civility to the discourse about this topic, because we think we've lost it. I'm really excited about it. We've got a great team. Of course, Katie, you're on our advisory board, but it includes a lot of other people who perspectives I really value. And frankly, my message to anybody listening to this is that if you think that you have any interest in collaborating with us, if you have any interest in even just having a conversation about these issues, we are Big Tent. We are an open door. We are willing to reach out, even if you think that we don't agree on anything. And have those conversations with anybody who wants to, again, return that truth and civility to our national discourse ahead of an important election. And so look out for some of the investigations that we'll be doing into deceptive information practices. Look out for our education campaigns, but we're excited about what's in store over the less than 6 months than we have before the election, and what's to come after that as well.
Yeah, and I can just vouch too for, the few conversations that, well, you and I've talked for a long time, but like being a part of the advisory board and meeting the team and stuff like that, like very open, because there were times, for the listeners, I was like, hang on, please don't paint all Republicans with the brush of like doing this, and it's not intentional, but I think there was a big openness to sort of being like, oh, wait, you're right. We need to think about this in a nuanced way for how we can be
Well,
bringing in the right voices.
absolutely. And I think to put a finer point on it, I don't believe that Jim Jordan and his cronies represent the Republican Party. We have seen interesting kind of folks coming out and saying, hang on a second, we don't like seeing Russian talking points in, the caucus of the GOP. We don't see that. We don't like that. It doesn't represent what we think. And that's the sort of thing that I think it's really heartening to see that. And it shows that we hopefully will be getting back to, again, more truth grounded conversations in the future. And we're so lucky to have your kind of big brain advising us on these issues as we go forward, Katie.
The other thing I like too is that the first act you all did was asking Jordan to release all the transcripts of the interviews that he has done. And I'm a big believer that we need to get away from discussing what content is or is not okay. We should study it and understand what's being put out there. But it's really about having the right checks and balances in place to be holding tech accountable, government accountable, civil society, all the actors in society accountable. And you can only do that if you have transparency. And they've been selectively putting out parts of these transcripts in retaliation to people like Kate Starbird, who I was on 60 Minutes with around this. And so just really quickly, as we're wrapping up, like, why was that sort of the first thing that you all wanted to tackle?
Well, I did my interview with the committee in April of 2023, so over a year ago. I saw my transcript once to correct it for errors. And since then, it has been kept under lock and key by Jim Jordan and the subcommittee on the weaponization of government. And I know he's done dozens of other interviews, not only with researchers like me, but with folks in the trust and safety community at different platforms and with government employees. And I know these people and I know their stories and I know the work that they've all been engaging in. And that work was not censorship. And they were there under oath saying that they did not censor anyone, that they did not coerce anyone. And I believe the American people deserve to know the full story there. And, if I'm a political actor like Jim Jordan ahead of an election, what I'm going to be doing is exactly what he's already started to do: selectively release transcripts, leak them to, supportive publications, frame that narrative, and to make it look like that committee is doing something. If people want to watch some really interesting congressional hearings, they can look for the May 1st hearing of the weaponization subcommittee, where the Democrats kind of picked up on the frame that we have provided and said, you know what, you should be releasing these transcripts because here we are talking about censorship today, and you're making these huge allegations, and 25 different witnesses from tech platforms went on the congressional record to say that they were not censored or coerced by the Biden administration. And yet you're here making these big allegations without putting this stuff on the record. So I think, this is a type of pre-bunking campaign. We want to put Congressman Jordan, Chairman Jordan on notice about that, and anybody who's repeating this narrative. And we want to say to the American people, hey, you're going to hear one story from this committee, but it's not the full story. And I think we've been pretty successful about that. And again, we believe in Congressman Jordan's ability and the necessity of transparency and oversight of government in these situations, but it needs to be conducted with and grounded in reality. And so far, that hasn't happened.
Yeah, I can't agree more. I think there's some very legitimate questions that we need to be talking about here, but the way in which it's being I think is really, really poor. Well, Nina, thank you so much for joining us. I can't wait to see the conspiracy theories that they come up about the two of us. I think we're already both secret CIA operatives. So we'll have to see what new thing comes out of this conversation. But I really appreciate you coming on. I really appreciate you. You could have just slunk away and just gave up on a lot of this. And the fact that you, Renee, Kate, so many people are saying, no, this is important work. You don't get to treat us this way. It's just something I just admire. And so thank you so much.
Well, thank you. We're happy to continue to do the work because it's important work. And we're happy to have partners like you in doing it.
All right. Thanks so much.